Okay, so this is going to be section 6 of chapter 4. We don't cover section 7 of chapter 4. So this is the last component that you're responsible for this exam. And this section is going to talk about covering and lining membranes. We already talked about serous membranes before, but we're going to re-review them today. So when we're talking about covering or lining membranes, these are going to be composed of at least 2 primary tissue types. Typically, it's going to consist of the epithelia tissue with the underlying connective tissue. Now we learn that it's more correctly the connective tissue proper layer, which is most often areolar connective tissue. We have 3 different types of covering and lining membranes. We have cutaneous, mucous, and serous membranes. So if we're talking about cutaneous membranes, the big thing to distinguish this one from the others is that it's actually a dry membrane. So if you think about our skin, that's an example of our cutaneous membrane. We do have a specific tissue type that makes up our cutaneous membrane, and that is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. That's going to make up the epidermis, which is the most superficial layer of our skin. Just deep to our epidermis is the dermis, and the dermis is going to be the layer of that connective tissue proper that's underneath. So like I mentioned, this is a dry membrane. The second type of membrane we have is a mucous membrane. So this is going to be lining our internal body cavities that are actually exposed to the external environment. Mucous membranes are also called mucosa. So they're going to line things like our digestive tract, respiratory tract, as well as our urogenital tract. And they're called mucous membranes, so they are going to be moist because they're constantly going to be bathed by secretions or urine if we're talking about the urogenital tract. And we still have our epithelial layer that's actually going to be making up the most superficial layer of these membranes. And then just deep to that, we're going to have connective tissue. The connective tissue can also be called the lamina propria and may secrete mucus. So they don't always have to secrete mucus. The key to identifying a mucous membrane is that it's lining some sort of internal cavity that's exposed to the outside environment. So everything over here highlighted in blue would contain a mucous membrane. And then we have our serous membranes, and again, we already talked about these, but I'll mention it again here. So these are found in our body cavities that are closed off from the external environment. So we have mucous membranes if they're exposed, like our respiratory tract, to the external environment. If they're closed off from the environment, then it's a serous membrane. So these are going to be constructed from simple squamous epithelium, also called, we talked about this, mesothelium. So that's a specific type of simple squamous epithelia. And it's going to be resting on connective tissue because all epithelial tissue is resting on connective tissue, but specifically areolar connective tissue. When we're talking about the serosae that line and make up these membranes, it's a double layer membrane. So one's going to be the parietal membrane and one's going to be the visceral membrane that make up that double layer. The parietal one's going to be the one that actually lines the body or the cavity walls, and the visceral membrane is going to be the one that's touching the organ itself. So we can name these based off of the location of which cavity. So if we're talking about the lungs, we refer to it as pleura. If we talk about the heart, we're talking about the pericardium. If we're talking about our abdomen or abdominopelvic region, that's going to be the peritoneum. So we can have a parietal pleura, so that would be a membrane that's lining the thoracic cavity, or we can have a visceral pleura, that would be the membrane that's actually covering the lungs themselves. And same thing with the heart and the abdomen. So if we're talking about the cavity that our heart is actually residing in, that would be lined by the parietal pericardium. On the surface of the heart itself would be the visceral pericardium. And if we're talking about our abdomen, the organs that are within our abdominopelvic cavity would be lined with visceral peritoneum, and the abdominopelvic cavity itself would be lined with parietal peritoneum. And that's it, because we are not going to cover section 4.7, and you will not be tested on that section either.